I hope you see on the bulletin we've announced what we're going to be preaching on for the first bit of the year, God willing. I've got a series on church and a series on Revelation in term 2, church in term 1. But seeing as it's January, everything goes strange in January, every place around the world, and that includes church. We're doing a couple of one-offs. We did something on, is this not turned on? Is it turned off, is it? Doing something on church for the rest of term 1 and doing something on Revelation in term 2. But in January, we've done a couple of one-offs and some topics that hopefully are geared to helping us think about living as Christians. And today, the talk I've called Mission Thinking, and I hope that becomes a bit clearer as we go through. But it is, again, a bit of a different talk. We're not going through a Bible passage, looking at it and particularly pulling it apart and hearing God's message there, even though we will turn to God's Word. But we are thinking about being God's people in the world and thinking about some things that we're going to be doing as a church, I hope. Now, January for me, one of the things that January means is that I get a new missionary prayer booklet from CMS. I've been a prayer supporter of CMS for, I don't know, a few years now. And every year they print this booklet and it's got every missionary or individual or family and a little bit of an explanation of where they are. And you get updates about the prayer points. So every year, a new booklet, and over about 3 decades of being in CMS, I'm slowly picking up some of the patterns, the things that people ask for prayer again and again. I'm a bit of a slow learner, so I think 3 decades is not too bad. I didn't spend quite that long in primary school, but you know, it may have seemed like that at times. But one of the things that I've noticed is that new missionaries, those who go to a new area, one of the constantly repeated prayer points is prayer for help in learning language and culture. Prayer for help in learning language and culture. Maybe they're somewhere in Australia and they're picking up one of the Aboriginal languages if they're going to be involved in translation of the Bible. And they want to know how to live in a particular culture, be it in Arnhem Land or Groote Eylandt or whatever it happens to be. They want to fit in a way that doesn't offend people. And that's the same if they're learning Swahili or an African-oriented French or something like that. Or people are going now to Europe as missionaries in Germany and France and Italy. So learning language and culture will help these missionaries fit in and explain the message of Jesus clearly. That's a constant request. And so I'm very happy to be reminded to pray that every year. It's true for people in Australia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, all those sorts of places. I think knowing what people speak like and what people think is an act of love, isn't it? If you were to go to, I don't know, somewhere in North Africa and understand the patterns of daily life and what families are like and how people work and how people relax, then it will put you in a much better position to engage with them and show all sorts of love to them, including the love of explaining the message of Jesus and of faith and of grace alone. So praying for understanding language and culture is praying really for practical love, I think. Now, as I think about this, I still have a surprising recollection of chatting with a missionary friend once, a guy I knew from Bible college. And he was surprised talking about a fellow missionary on the field in Southeast Asia, where they are. And his missionary friend had decided, he made a conscious decision to only speak English and never learn the local language. And he made a conscious decision to teach only through a translator and always teach through a translator. That was this particular, it's a second-hand, I don't know who the person was, but my friend has probably spent 20 years immersed in the language with him and his family, and he thought, no, it's much better if I speak the local language and I'm at the Bible college. But, as I said, there was someone there, and there were a number of people, according to this missionary friend of mine, who'd said, no, the local language is too hard, it will just take too much of my time, I will rely on translators in my Bible class. Now, you can see the reasons for that. It is a big investment of time and energy to learn a language, and you'll never be as good as a local, but still, I was surprised. It's easier to speak in English for me. And if I was going to go to Southeast Asia or to North Africa or to wherever it is, it would be tempting to say, okay, I'm going to force you people to listen to me in my language. It's easier. Language is tough. But I think the better way is the harder way, to learn the language and culture. That's true in Lagos, it's true in Laos, it's true in Lithuania, it's true in everywhere, I reckon. And it's true in Australia, it's true in Albury Wodonga as well.
And did you know that in Australia we have one of the hardest languages in the world?
One of the hardest languages in the world in Australia,
To
yep.
understand.
Yep, Oka. Nobody understands it at all. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of difficult languages. Now, Albury Bible Church, like every church around the world, should be a mission active church. So though we've been thinking about missionaries, and I had one or two particular friends in mind as I was writing these notes earlier, Albury Bible Church is a mission church. We should be reaching out with the gospel of grace. Now, there are two things recently that have made me ask again how well I'm working for mission in Albury Wodonga and how well we are working as a church as well. The first thing is the one I've already told you about, these missionary prayer points where people are asking for skill and help from God in learning language and culture. That's the first thing. If people are praying that for going to whatever part of the world, then how am I doing? Am I, I know most of the language of people in Albury Wodonga, but have I understood the culture? Do I know what people think like? Am I engaging in a way that is going to be clear as possible? It's a good thought to consider. Perhaps you can help me reflect on that and help us as a church reflect on that. But the second thing that's made me reflect is this book, which I got, I think, at the end of last year. And I just realised the print on the front is very small. So I'm holding it up there, hoping, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self is what it's called, by a bloke called Carl Trueman. That book's been one that's made me think about life and culture and understanding. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Now, the content is a bit full on and it's a lot of brain work, so it took me a long time to read it. But really it's about understanding our own culture in places in the West, like the UK or the USA or Australia, New Zealand, that kind of place. It's understanding our way of thinking. It's asking the question, what are we like? Well, you could say it's asking, what is this mission field we're in? What are some of the dynamics of how people think? How do I think and how do our neighbours think? Perhaps I need to change some of my thinking, and certainly I can understand my neighbours better as an act of love. Now, today is certainly not a book review about it, but I'm going to take some of the ideas from the book and then we'll turn towards the end at some implications for our Christian life or our church life, one or two implications. So I'm not planning on a long sermon, but it's a sermon where the aim is to help us move forward in mission. So you can reflect with me whether I've done that and how we can move forward together as a result of what we think about today. But firstly, here's a general question. Have you ever heard people tell you, just incidentally in a conversation, have you ever heard people tell you what they are like? With a statement like, I'm a fighter, or I'm tough, or I always stand up for what's right, or I don't go in for it. Have you had that sort of conversation with a person? They just might be in a meeting, a formal meeting, or it might be an informal get-together, and people tell you what they're like. Got any examples of people saying that kind of thing?
Interview.
Sorry?
If you interview a candidate, you actually expect them to present themselves
Okay.
and talk about.
Interview candidates, you want to find out about the person. Yep. Okay. Yeah, John, sure. I thought you were going to say something, Joy. You were. I don't gossip, not like those people over there. Yep, yeah. That's right. Yeah, it's a kind of thing we'd understand, isn't it? Have you got?
I've got a friend that always says, I'm independent, I don't like asking for help.
Okay, I'm independent, I don't like asking for help. Which sounds like a way of asking for help, doesn't it, actually? But not actually asking for help. Okay, so but that sort of language is sort of thing that I've heard, certainly. That when people say what they're like, I'm tough-minded, I don't put up with that kind of rubbish, whatever it happens to be. So it's one thing that is not unusual for us. It's not that unusual. Now, Carl Trueman, who wrote this particular book that I pointed out, like many other people and authors, he shows that in the modern world, we tend to think of our true self as our interior life. That's a funny phrase, that, isn't it? Couldn't come up with anything better. Who am I really? Who am I really? I'm a fighter. I'm a lover. I'm going to break into song, I don't know. Who am I really? Who am I really becomes the answer to that. What's my psychology like? How do I feel? How do I think? What's going on in my head or in my heart? That's the modern way of thinking, and it hasn't been the way of thinking for humans in every culture in all times. But in places like Australia, in Albury, Wodonga, our true self is the inner me. You could say that I am my psychology and that you are your psychology. Now, sometimes when people express themselves in those ways, it may involve categories from the cheap and nasty psychological tests. Have you ever done the Myers-Briggs type indicator? You know, I'm an ABCD, I can't remember all the letters, an IJTX, I don't know what they are. People do those things and they say, oh, that describes me so well, or I'm a melancholic, or I'm a pragmatic, or I'm a whatever it is. There are different categorisations. So, and using those is a way of saying, I know who I really am, it's my inner self, it's my thinking. Sometimes it goes extreme. So if you hear someone say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, that's not me saying that, by the way, okay? That's a claim to inner knowledge. I know who I am in myself. You may see my body that looks like a wonderful athletic man. Why'd you laugh at that point? Could have paused for a little bit there before laughing, Nancy. Thank you very much. But I know who I am. I am my inner life. And that's something that is pretty common. The real me is the interior me, which I can know and you can only accept and affirm when I tell you. I am the expert on me, and there is no external authority that has anything to add. That's kind of a modern approach to the self, to what we're like, in the influence of Europe and America and places like Australia and New Zealand as well. Now, we could say that we've psychologised humanity, but the thing about making humanity psychologically defined is one of the implications is it dismantles external authority or general standards. If I say, I know I'm a good person, then I'm convinced of that, then I'm asserting that, and you have no right to deny that. And to say I'm a good person, that's much more true than if you say back to me, but you lie to your co-workers all the time. Well, I may have had to say that, but I know deep inside I'm a good person. See, that's kind of language, that discussion that people have. Or if I say, I'm a kind and caring person, that's the truth, if I believe it to be true. And you're not allowed to say back to me, but you abandoned your children. You can't be caring and kind. No, I am caring and kind. That was necessary, painful. But I'm caring and kind because I define myself by my psychology. My internal point of view becomes reality. And if my internal point of view becomes reality, then anything external doesn't have authority. And that's kind of a mindset. We might talk about this later when it comes to question time and comment time. The external reality is automatically ruled out. So there's one thing. We tend to view ourselves as our inner life. That's the real me. And I don't know how many soap operas and movies and dramas and things say, you don't know the real me. I want you to know the real me. I want to live as the true self I am, that kind of thing. But there's a second point from that book about the rise of the modern self. And again, only using this book as a help to us thinking about how our world lives and perhaps how we think ourselves as individuals or as a church. A second point is this. How do we analyse situations and groups? We tend to analyse situations, groups, by the dynamics of power. We're looking for a victim and an oppressor. The person who's in charge, and you don't trust the person in charge, do you? And the person who's subject to the folks who are in charge, and you sympathise with them. It's almost like a gut reaction, that's what this book is saying, that we analyse things by power relations and by siding with the victim, the oppressor, even if they claim to be the victim, the oppressed I should say, and siding against the oppressor or the one who has power. That's just a natural kind of way of thinking nowadays in the West. Anyone with power is a problem, and they're always a problem. Anyone who's a victim, well, they've won the conversation, they've won the debate, whatever it happens to be. Power is everywhere, and the most respected position to be in is in the position of a victim. Now, this second point about analysing things by power relations or by oppressor-victim dynamic, there's something helpful and good in this, isn't there? Because as soon as we know anything about history, we know that power has been used brutally, hasn't it? kings and queens and emperors and empresses, slave owners, and people have been subject to power, slaves, workers, kids sent into mines or in cotton mills in the UK, that kind of thing. We know that power has been oppressive and abusive, and people have died and suffered in all sorts of other ways as well. So there's something helpful and good in the idea of understanding that power is a real thing, but there's also something dangerous too, because again, analysing everything by power only once more abandons the ideas of external truth, that there is a general reality. You can't say that person is doing a good thing. He can't be doing a good thing because he's a prime minister or a premier or whatever it happens to be. He's a boss, therefore he's by nature a suspect. So we've given up ethics and we've given up general reality, and we've substituted in power relationships. And what we end up with is aesthetics really, and emotionalism. I feel like I'm being oppressed by you. No, I'm asking you to do your job. No, but I feel like you're oppressing me. I don't want to clean up after myself at my job, at my workplace. I don't want to turn up on time and work to the end of my shift. No, you're just being oppressive. You could understand that kind of conversation, couldn't you, in a workplace? I hope you haven't had it. But that dynamic is one that is perfectly familiar to me anyway. So instead of ethics, we end up with emotionalism and aesthetics, how things look. That's what we say, doesn't it? Oh, that doesn't look good. Or it fails the pub test. It's not whether it's right or wrong, it's whether the people at the pub feel nice about it or feel bad about it. That's what we're left with. That's what we're left with. We're left with gut instinct. Now, later as we have question time, I'd like it probably to be a bit more of a comment time and a sharing time where we can think together and share together some ideas. And one thing I'd love sharing on later is this. Hopefully I'll remember the question by the end of it. What do you think is our local culture? Albury, Wodonga, Australia if you like, or broader. What is our local culture? What are some of the dynamics that we face? Because those dynamics would be good to understand as we go out there and try to say Jesus is alive and he'd love to forgive you. If we can understand the local culture, we might be able to make things clearer, as that verse from the kids' talk was talking about too. How can we speak more clearly? And we want to understand our local culture, not to be people who carp and complain about our local culture and who think that everything's going to pot. And we're not going to try and set up an us and them dynamic of they are bad people and we are the good people here. No, we don't want to do that. We want to understand our local culture just for the sake of understanding and love, for the sake of speaking more clearly. We're trying to understand to be better missionaries. What is our local culture? But before we do have our question and comment time, another point from the book. Where do you think we stand as Christians and as a church at this point in history? What are we like? Is there any point in history that is like where we are today, 2022, early 21st century? Well, one thing from this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, that's interesting, is to say that there is a time in history where the church existed and Christians were around, and that is somewhat similar, has some similarities at least to our present time. The current state of the Christians in the church, it's not like the 1950s in Australia or in America. It's not like Victorian England, where the church was a pretty much accepted social reality and you'd be a member of the church. And it's not like we're living in Reformation Europe, 16th century Europe, where people are talking about theology and the ideas of God are driving politics and ethics and medical progress and all that sort of stuff and science. And we're not in any of those places. The place that we stand in history is probably most like being a Christian in the 2nd century. That is in the years 100 to 200. The place where we stand is most like the 2nd century AD, the hundreds. Because in the 2nd century, the 100s, Christians existed and churches existed in many different countries and many different cultures and spoke many different languages. But the Christian faith, through the Roman Empire as it was still around then, the Christian faith was different from local belief and culture. So, for example, emperor worship was a real thing in the 2nd century and growing and becoming a little bit more angry at times. That is, oppressing people, pushing people to have to sacrifice to the emperors as a god. But another thing was that Christians were different. They stood out for caring for weak people and the sick. Quite often in the Roman world, a lot of the thinking and the philosophy was, if you're weak and you're sick, then you're disposable. You're not that important. But Christians were weird by caring for the weak and the sick, by accepting women, by not encouraging unwanted kids to be left out to die and to be exposed, by being against abortion. Those were some of the characteristics of the 2nd century. Christian faith in the 2nd century often went against local belief and culture. And Christians were often distrusted, were mocked, were attacked. There was gossip about them. The idea of brothers and sisters getting together for a meal, that is the Lord's Supper, in some cases that was construed as, oh, these Christians are incestuous. Brothers and sisters are loving one another. That is, they're having sex with one another. That's the kind of slander that was put on Christians in the 2nd century. Just because of misunderstanding and distrust. And there was a build-up through the 2nd century towards a much more serious persecution, which really hit more hard in the 3rd century AD, but that's a different matter. So we're a bit like at the 2nd century Christians. If you do want to know about that, here's another book, Christianity at the Crossroads by Michael Kruger. It's very interesting if you're interested in history and theology and where the church comes from. I can lend it to you. I can wait. I'm just waving it around because I know you can't read the cover, so I'm not going to pretend. I'm just trying to be active. So that's a bit where we're like. That's again a point from Truman's book about the rise of the modern self. Where we are is like a bit like Christians in the 2nd century. And guess what? Christians in the 2nd century survived, and the church survived the 2nd century. And guess what? Christians survived, Christianity survived, and the church changed the world. Not by engaging in a culture war, by winning elections, by taking control of the local council or the local government or anything like that. Christians survived, Christianity survived and changed the world by living the gospel of Jesus, day by day, town by town, year by year. The church did not aim to win the culture or to defeat the culture, but the church aimed to live out better a culture of faith, love and hope. That's what the Christians in the 2nd century did. So we may be mocked, we may be even killed at times for not worshipping the emperors, we may be misunderstood and slandered in our relationships of love for one another. We may be looked down upon for accepting all comers. Even the poor are welcome at these churches, and they mix with the rich and the business people, the businessmen and women. All those things may happen, but the Christian said, well, we'll just get on with doing our Christian life, living out faith and hope and love. They understood where they were, but they understood also what God wanted them to do. And we learn a little bit about that from our 2 Bible readings, don't we? Psalm 1. What is the blessed person? The blessed person is the one who delights in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates both day and night. That's the blessed person. That's what the Christians in the 2nd century had to do. And really a lot of early commentaries come from the 2nd century. Some of the earliest writings about the Bible from Christians are in the 2nd century. And that meditation on God's law, both day and night, is something that should characterise us even as we understand better the culture of Albury, Wodonga, Australia or other parts of the world. That's Psalm 1. Romans 12 also talks about living by faith. Talks about living by faith because of God's mercy, in view of God's mercy. And it says, did you know the forming words? Don't conform to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The culture that we live in any part of the world, is a strongly formative thing. The way we live, the way we live together will form us into something. The types of schools we have, the types of workplaces we have, the types of transport even, whether we have access to different parts of the world, the types of commerce and shopping. Those things can form us in a particular way. What do you think advertising is about? It's about forming us into people who are consumers in the modern West. And Romans 12 says, don't be conformed to the way of the world. Do be shaped though, Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by the Spirit at work, by knowledge of the mercies of God. And that, I think, is our job. We may benefit from understanding our culture, language and culture of Australia, language of culture of whatever part of the world we're from and live in, but we are called to be transformed away from that culture, that we may know the will of the Lord, that we may trust Christ and follow Christ. So in other words, when we look at the world around us and understand our culture better, as I said, we're not about setting up an us and them and criticising people. When we look at the world and see the problems everywhere, I think the Christian reaction is to ask this of ourselves: does that problem lie in me? Not, is it their problem? Is she doing the wrong thing? Are they off beam? You know, those things might be worth thinking about at some point. But the basic and first response is this: does that problem lie in me, or does it lie in us as a church? And instead, let us allow God to change us by His word, by His truth, by meditating day and night upon the law of the Lord, by being metamorphosed, by being transformed rather than by being conformed to the way of the world. Of course, the world and culture that we're in will move and change, and the way Australia goes will be different in 50 years, different in 100 years. What happens in Albury-Wodonga, well, it's unpredictable. But we want it to be changed not by us being militants and being angry, but we want the culture of Albury-Wodonga to be changed partly by us being a faithful church, and partly by them being a faithful church, and partly by them being a faithful church, and every church in Albury-Wodonga and every Christian in Albury-Wodonga being faithful and transformed by the Word of God. Every church community will live out and grow as Christ's people with a dynamic of life at our heart. Romans 12 really is a great example of our call to the future. Not to be angry about our culture, but to understand it. Not to be angry, but to be transformed by something better than our culture. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, I appeal to you, family of God, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, that's pretty much what I want to say, but I do want us to open up to think about what is our culture? How well do we understand it? Do we understand it well enough to reach out? And if there are any questions that you want to ask about issues that I raised, then we'll have a chance to talk about that. If you want anything else from the books or a bit more of a book review, then by all means ask and let us know. But I'm going to stop the video in a minute and lead in prayer, and then we can go to a question and comment time.